welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. It's another round of questions and answers here on the Old Front Line podcast, and as always you can submit your questions and lots continue to come in, which many thanks for that, and do keep them coming. So you can submit them via two main methods. One of them is via email, and all of the questions in this week's Q&As come via email, or via the Discord server, which is a bit of software you can log on, a bit like a chat room, and you can go on there and you can leave a question there as well. Links to both of those are in the show notes and on the podcast website, telling you how to do it. You just click on the link and it will take you straight through, whether email or Discord server. You can also send in fan mail, which is a new thing put out there by Buzzsprout, and that sends me a text basically through their system, and I can look at the question that way. But email and Discord probably the easiest ways. So let's move on to this week's questions, and we've got four really good ones, and the first of those comes from Jim Hegarty on email. Jim says, I'm a big fan of the podcast from Sydney, Australia. With regards to interest regarding subjects away from the Somme, I wondered if your listeners would be interested in part of the 1914-18 war that is not commonly known, particularly in the humanity shown by both sides in a horrific conflict. My grandfather, Edward Topham, 17th Lancers, was taken prisoner somewhere on the Western Front, and then I assume transported from a German camp to Mürren in Switzerland as an internee. Please find a photograph taken outside the Hotel Jungfrau, still a hotel today, circa 1418. I can find no information on his service in the usual places such as Ancestry or the Red Cross site. He is seated front row, third from left, with a possible leg wound. My question is, are there any German websites that list British prisoners of war, where and how they were captured and which camps they were taken to, and also any German sites that list those lucky chosen and why they were put forward as candidates to be internees for Switzerland? Well, Jim's picture is actually the image that I've used for the artwork for this particular episode. So you can have a look at his picture because it'll be on your podcast software or on the website as well. And it's a really interesting question. And as Jim suggests, it's not well known that British and German soldiers, Allied soldiers as well as Germans, went to Switzerland during the period of the First World War. When we kind of think of Switzerland, we think of the end of the Western Front, that strange bit of ground where the border of Germany, which was Alsace-Lorraine, annexed after the Franco-Prussian War and is back to being French soil today, but then it was German soil, met with the French border, but it also met with the Swiss border. So three countries came together at what became the end of the Western Front. And Switzerland was a neutral country, so it didn't take part in the war. Swiss citizens had emigrated all over the world, and if you look at Canadians and Australians, you'll come across people from Switzerland who did serve and in some cases did die in the Great War, but Switzerland as a country kept out of the conflict, although at the end of the Western Front in that area, close to those borders, it did keep troops there to make sure that the Germans didn't come through their soil and the French didn't do the same. But what it did do is intervene with the movement of prisoners of war. So what happened was, on both sides, with German soldiers and Allied soldiers, there were men who were so seriously wounded that they were unlikely and almost certainly would never serve again, so couldn't return to combat, couldn't fight again on whatever theatre of war it would be. And it was decided that those men, it was unfair to keep them as prisoners. It was using up a lot of resources on both sides to keep those men in camps. So the humane and decent thing to do was to exchange those prisoners via Switzerland. This is something that went on throughout the First World War, and I've researched many, many men who ended up in Switzerland. In some cases, they were interned there for a period of the war and then released. In some cases, they were there for a very long time. Some cases, it was a short period, and then they were sent home, particularly if they were very seriously wounded, so had lost a limb, for example. But it was something that happened. Great numbers of men basically passed through Switzerland. I don't have an exact figure, and if anyone's got any kind of details of this in terms of the numbers, I'd be really, really interested to know. Just as a casual glance through the list of officer prisoners of war that was published by Cox & Co., the army bankers, that lists all the officers who were taken prisoner, where they were captured, and then what happened to them. There's a huge number of references to men being sent through Switzerland in that. And if you've listened to the episode about Hawthorne Ridge, you'll know that Francis Sidney Cochrane, who was the adjutant of the 16th Middlesex, was wounded in the attack on the Hawthorne mine, captured by the Germans, so badly wounded that he was exchanged through Switzerland in 1917-18, I think it was. So it was something that was quite prolific, and it wasn't just Allied soldiers coming back to their respective countries, France, Belgium, Britain, and the wider Commonwealth Empire as it was then. It was German soldiers going back the other way. So we exchanged German prisoners essentially for Allied prisoners, and the Germans did the same on their side, and Switzerland was very heavily involved in this. The Red Cross was based in Switzerland, and they ran all of the records of men who were captured in the Great War. And Jim alludes to this. He says he's had a look at the Red Cross website, and I also had a look as well, Jim. I couldn't see your relative Edward Topham on there, which is unusual for a man who was so obviously taken prisoner. So what I do know is that the Red Cross do have additional records, the stuff that is online. And if any of you are researching a prisoner of war in the Great War, you can go on to the Red Cross website, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes for this. And you can put a name in there, and it comes up with a card for that soldier, and then it gives you some reference numbers, and then that takes you to the files showing where they were captured, when they were captured, and the camps that they went on to be held in. But there are a whole group of records which as yet have not been digitised. It's not that they've not been released, but they're just not available online. So what I would suggest, Jim, is that you contact the Red Cross, tell them the circumstances of your relative who's been taken prisoner and ended up in Switzerland, and they may have additional information. In terms of German websites, I don't think there are any. There will have been German records of prisoners, but I don't think that they will contain names. I don't remember ever seeing any in any German archive that I've looked at. I'm not saying that they're not there, but I think what essentially would happen with men who were captured on the battlefield is that it would be the Red Cross that would process this information. The Germans wouldn't contact the War Office. The War Office would not contact the German army to say that Gefreiter Schmidt had been captured at Courcelette or whatever. That wouldn't happen. It would be managed by the Red Cross. And having interviewed men who were captured in the Great War, they all said that when they got to a particular point in the evacuation chain away from the battlefield as prisoners, there would be a Red Cross representative who would come to them with a card, and they would get them to fill in their details: name, rank, number, unit, date and place of capture, home address, next of kin details, and the Red Cross would then process this, which is how they have all these records that you can look at online. So I don't think there's any German sources that will help with this. I'm very, very eager and willing to be proved wrong on that. And I know we have quite a few German listeners to the podcast. And if any of you can shine any further light on that, please do get in touch via email or Discord server and let me know. And I can do this as a follow-up. There's a few follow-ups, I think, to some of these questions that I might put in a kind of extra episode somewhere further down the lines, because these questions prompt an answer from me and often a little bit of correspondence from many of you, and that is really, really interesting and fascinating. So this whole kind of experience in Switzerland during the Great War, it is largely forgotten. There are some first-hand accounts of it. There's quite a lot of prisoner of war memoirs on the British side, many of them read by young schoolboys in the 20s that would go on to be captured and end up in places like Colditz themselves, kind of inspired by these memoirs. And it is something that's is very interesting to research, and interesting in this case. And thank you, Jim, for sending that image in, because I've not seen too many photographs of British prisoners in Switzerland. So that's kind of added something to this as well. So get in touch with the Red Cross, Jim. Let us know how you get on, and we'll perhaps do a follow-up with that as well. So a fascinating question about that aspect of the Great War, men who were prisoners of the Kaiser, guests of the Kaiser, guests of the Germans in those prisoner of war camps. And believe me, it was nothing like being a guest. It was a horrific experience for many of them. It's something we still haven't yet covered on the podcast, and here he goes promising another one, but we will get round to that sometime soon. So thanks for that excellent question, Jim. Question number 2 comes from Anne, and she asked, in a recent Q&A, you discussed looking for artefacts while walking the battlefields. My question, as one who only remembers a little basic French, is how to ask for permission to access these fields. Is it a case of knocking on doors and hoping I can make my wishes understood, and that it is in fact the correct farmhouse, or is there a more formal process? I understand walking in fields where crops are growing is not acceptable, although I've seen people doing just that on previous battlefield visits. Well, I guess at the heart of this, Anne, is we've got to understand that the landscape of the First World War, to succeed in what we want it to be that place where the past and the present meet, has to exist side by side with the landscape of the past. But it's not a museum. The landscape today is not a museum. It is a working landscape, a farming landscape, particularly in places like Arras and the Somme, and so much along that French part of the Western Front as you head down towards the Champagne and beyond. So it's a working environment, and the fields are private property. We have no legal rights of access. The pathways are accessible. They are what we would call public rights of way. It's a different kind of law in France, but you can use the pathways, but the fields are private property. However, during the winter months, when there's no crops in those fields, very few French farmers are going to get funny about you walking across them. What they don't want to see is people digging or using metal detectors and things like that, and I'm sure, Anne, that isn't your purpose here. But if you want to follow a trench line and stand on a spot where a relative was killed and do that kind of research and really connect with that landscape by walking it at that time of year when the fields are cropless, then that is a good time to do it. And what I've found is if you're in these fields and walking them and a farmer turns up, the best thing is to do, stop what you're doing and walk straight towards that person and have as best of a conversation you can in their language, French, to tell them what it is you're doing. And in most cases, they'll just wave you on your way and it'll be absolutely fine. Otherwise, if you want to do this properly, and this would be true not just for fields, but for woods, mine craters, whatever it is that exists in another area of private property, is do it officially. Don't try and find who the landowner is, because that's a complex thing in France. When I lived in Courcelette, the fields around the house where I lived were not necessarily owned by one person. One strip could be owned by somebody in Courcelette, another one in the neighbouring village of Martinpuy or down the road at Le Sars. So it was quite a complex thing. The best thing to do is go to the town hall, the mairie, and find the mayor. The mayor will know who the owner is. They have what's called a cadastral plan that shows all of the parcels of land that exist within that commune and who the owners are, and they'll probably know off the top of their head whose field it is anyway, or whose wood it is, and they'll be able to say, go and speak to Pierre or Jacqueline or whoever it is. They'll put you in touch with them, and you will need some French. A lot of French people do speak some English, but it's always better to approach this in French, and they will help you find the right person to get the right kind of access. And they might want to arrange a visit so that they're there, so they know your intentions are good. And this can be a really good way of forging links between us who visit the battlefields, who appreciate the landscape of the past, and those who are guardians of that landscape and use the landscape of the present. And it's a good way of bringing those two groups of people together. And I've done it many, many times over the years where I've had requests from people who wanted to visit a particular area, and I've gone to the mairie, I've gone to the mayor, found out who whose land it was, or whose wood it was, or whose lane it was, or whatever it is, and then go on to see them, explain what we're doing, and it's been a very successful visit. And what it's enabled me to do through doing it properly like that is to get to places that aren't open to the public. Trench lines in woods, mine craters tucked away in private land, get to visit a particular field with a family because they want to stand on the spot where Grandad went over the top, and then talking to the landowner, he says, well, I've got this barn full of stuff that I've found over the years. Do you want to come and see it? And then hearing their family stories, and the photo albums come out. So it can be a very enriching experience. And like I say, I think it's very, very important to do this properly, to forge these links so that the landowners, the guardians of that landscape, that working landscape today, can see that those of us who appreciate the landscape of the past and want to understand that more are good people who are coming there with good intentions. And I can't really overestimate the importance of that. The way the landscape of the First World War continues to be what it is, and continues to be as preserved as much as possible, is for those who understand and appreciate that landscape to work with those who live and farm and work and survive on that landscape today. And what I guess men and women who fought during that conflict did was to fight to give the rights of Belgian and French people, give them the right to do what they want freely in their own country. So we can't begrudge them the right to build houses and put wind farms up and build new canals and roads and motorways. The landscape has changed incredibly during the 4 decades of my visiting. And when I spoke to people like John Dray and Tony Spagnoli and John Giles and Rose Coombs during their decades of visiting long before me, long before I was even born, they had seen changes as well. It is a changing landscape. All landscapes change. But working in partnership with those on the ground, that's the way forward. So it's a simple question, yours, Anne. Go and find the landowner, talk to people when you see them, respect the fields outside of the times that they have crops in. Another aspect as well is that even during the approach to planting a crop, they'd often spray a field with excrement. And often that is not just animal, it can be human. So there is a disease issue there. Would you really want to walk around a field covered in that and put your hands in it and pick things up and touch things? You wouldn't really want to do that. So go and speak to the landowner, go and find the farmer, and they can give you the nod and make it safe. But I think there is a wider issue that your question kind of hints to here, and that is that relationship that we all have with those who are on that landscape today. And I think it's an important part of how, I guess, those battlefields and the old front line continues to be what it is for future generations. So a great question, Anne, and wherever you're heading off to, whatever your intention is here, do let us know, and let us know how you got on. Question number 3 comes from James Condron. James says, my great-great-uncle Herbert Guiver of the 2nd Essex is buried at Sucre near Collincamps. I was looking online this week and came across a newspaper article about Sucre. The article mentions a cafe in Bertrancourt, the town where Herbert was billeted shortly before his death. I found a photograph of a cafe, possibly an Estaminets during the war, and it is still there today. Of all the Estaminets cafes that were frequented by British soldiers during the war, how many are still in existence as modern-day cafes, and are there any in particular you'd recommend visiting? Now, this is a great question, James, and one I've been asked a few times by TV companies over the years when we've made documentaries where we've taken Who Do You Think You Are kind of style programs, and we've taken a famous individual back to a place where their relative had served in the Great War. Often they've got a letter or a diary that mentions life in an estaminet, those smoke-filled rooms full of British and Commonwealth Empire soldiers singing and drinking and laughing and pulling each other's legs and doing all kinds of stuff, of course. So they're very atmospheric places, and TV companies like that. And I found a few. Now, you ask how many there are and how many are still cafes. I can't answer that because for every village behind the lines, there were multiple cafes in Estaminets. If you just stuck to the Somme area and you went kind of west, northwest, and southwest of Albert, back towards Amiens, every village at the time of the Great War would have had, even the small ones, would have had 3 or 4 of these estaminets. Many of them were private houses that had a big room, often the front room, which they built a very basic bar in, and then soldiers would come in and there'd be kind of bench seats in there and drinks would be served, or there'd be tables outside. So they were often fairly primitive. And those kind of places generally have returned to being private residences. But in all of those little Somme villages, if you've found with Bertrancourt, for example, there are surviving places like that. I don't think many of them look exactly as they had done during the Great War. And that phrase estaminet, which at the time of the Great War was, there were 2 types of cafes, what we'd call a cafe today. There was a cafe that basically sold drinks, and there was an estaminet that sold drink, but more importantly for the soldiers, it sold food. And that was a big draw to them, to eat a decent-ish meal, which was different to army rations. And that phrase estaminet has kind of disappeared, has kind of lost in the French language today. Just like in Britain, a cafe is a cafe, you can get anything you want in there, but very few of them now do any kind of food. In the years that I've been going to the Somme, for example, there used to be a few little cafes on the battlefields where you could go along and just nod to Madame and she'd make you an omelette. There used to be a really nice one in Martinpuy, for example, near to the church, but they've all gone now. All those kind of places have just disappeared. But that's on the battlefield where nothing survived. Behind the lines, you will find buildings that once were estaminets. Occasionally, going through some of the villages, you'll see part of a sign, an old sign painted on the wall of one of these buildings, or you'll see the design of the house that is now private residence, maybe, that is obviously some kind of shop or cafe. And they're very often right in the centre of these villages. So they can be found, but very few of them are still working cafes. There's one near Lissenherk, actually, and this is one that I point out to when I take groups into Flanders, near Lissenherk Military Cemetery, near Popperinge. As you come off the road to go down to Lissenherk, on the corner there is the Delina estaminet, and that still has estaminet painted on the walls of the building. There's a whitewash strip, and then in black lettering, Delina estaminet. And that was an estaminet 110 years ago, during the Great War, frequented by men who were billeted near Popperinge. Just up the road was Huputri Hop Out, where soldiers got off the train. We've talked about that in a previous podcast episode. And of course, down the road were the personnel from the casualty clearing stations that were part of the Remy siding site, which today is Lissenherk Cemetery. And so this was a place frequented by British soldiers, and that is still there 110 years later. And you can go in there, and you don't just get drink, you can get food. And I've been in there a few times, actually. It's different atmosphere. It's a modern cafe, very nice place to go to, a restaurant as well as a cafe to get food and drink. But it is a place that you know once was full of khaki-clad soldiers, and that kind of gives it a bit of a edge. I remember saying to one of the staff in there something about this, and they kind of looked at me a bit strange. I don't think it was a USP or a selling point to them, but to us who visit these battlefields, it is. They're harder to find like that on the British part of the Western Front in France, and I can't think of any that survive now. There were a few, but they've disappeared. Rural communities in France lack cafes, lack shops, lack just about everything, really, which is why a lot of people have moved out of them. So those kind of places have disappeared. But if any of you have come across them, and they're still called estaminets, again, I love to hear your input on these questions, because I haven't visited every village in northern France, far from it. That's one of the great aspects of discovery when it comes to the subject of the Great War. But many of you will have been to places that I haven't, and you may have chanced across an estaminet that still is an estaminet and still has the word estaminet over the door. So let me know if you've come across one, and we can pass that on to James. But it's a great question. Estaminets was such an important part of the social life of soldiers on the Western Front, and to think of the atmosphere in there and what it meant to those men. And I remember so many veterans talking fondly about their times with their mates in those places. Often they would centre a story around a moment in which they're all getting ready for a forthcoming offensive, and that perhaps was the last time that group of friends got together before they went up the line, many of them on a one-way ticket, just like your great-great-uncle who went off and was killed in the trenches on the northern part of the Somme, and today is buried in that Sucre cemetery near Collincamps. So I guess it's not just the fields we walk and the lanes and the woods, it's buildings on that landscape of the Great War. They are part of those criss-cross paths, and Estaminets are very much a part of that. So thanks for that one, James. Our fourth and final question comes from John Thompson. All day yesterday and today, and this was written on the 1st of July this year. You can see how many questions I've got that I'm still dealing with ones from July. So John says, all day yesterday and today, I've had so many thoughts and emotions running through my head regarding the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And I think, John, like many of us, that's exactly the same kind of experience that we have. So John goes on to say, below are some questions that I have often thought about. We all know that the first wave starting over the top at 7:30 a.m, but at what time of day did the generals pull the plug on more attacks going over the top due to the amount of men killed, wounded and missing? When the attacks faded out later in the day, the sounds from the battlefield must have been horrific from injured and dying soldiers. When you interviewed the veterans, did they ever talk about the noise from no man's land when the guns fell silent? I mean, those are two great questions relating to that first day of the Battle of the Somme, John. Thanks for those. So, in terms of the first one, first waves going over the top at 7:30, and then wave after wave goes forward, and on so many parts of the front that day, there's absolutely nothing to show for these horrific casualties as wave after wave is subsequently wiped out in no man's land. Who pulls the plug on that? Well, plans were set in place, and they were pretty rigid, and they were set in stone, and in most cases, unit after unit goes over to often a pointless and futile attempt to try and get across the battlefield and get into the German trenches. And in most cases, when units like that go forward, only a handful of men make it to the German wire or get any kind of entry into the German trenches, so the attack breaks down very quickly, and there's nothing to show except the destruction of that unit. So it's almost like a group of automatons moving forward. There's no way to easily stop this. And there weren't many parts of the front in which observers on the ground who had connection through telephones or signallers to a headquarters where a senior officer, a brigadier general, brigade commander was located, there weren't many examples in which men were brave enough to say, this is all going dreadfully wrong, we need to stop it. There are a few, and there are a few on a kind of a localised basis. So many of you will have been to the Newfoundland Park at Beaumont-Hamel on the Somme, where the Newfoundland Regiment went over the top. They were attacking alongside the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment, who sent 2 companies forward and then had 2 companies behind that. And the commander of that unit saw his first 2 companies go over. My great-uncle, my Uncle Dan, being one of the men in one of those 2 companies, he got shot through the leg by machine gun bullets. He saw them be annihilated, and then he decided not to send any more men over. He didn't look back to the brigadier to get permission. He didn't go to divisional headquarters. He preempted his orders because he saw what had happened, I guess, to the Newfoundland Regiment, and he saw what had happened to the preceding waves of South Wales Borderers and Border Regiment men, and saw half his battalion get chewed to bits by machine gun fire and wouldn't send over the other half. Now, like I say, that kind of thing was pretty rare on the 1st of July. Officers would have been fearful of contradicting orders because of poor communications. They didn't know what was happening on their right or on their left. For all they knew, they were marching all the way to Berlin. It's just their bit that slowed down and stopped. So if they preempted an order and didn't attack, that could affect others on their flanks disastrously. So there was that kind of impulsion that pushed men forward to continue with these attacks. But in most cases, the senior officers, brigade, and in particular divisional commanders, had no clear idea on that 1st of July what had really happened. Few of them were in a position to see much. Beaurevoir de Lisle, who commanded the 29th Division, of which the Essex and the Newfoundlanders were a part, was in a forward bunker near Ocean Villas, but he could see some distant gun smoke, lines of men moving forward, not very much really, nothing to really for him to be able to base a decision on. That's why generals have chateaus behind the lines where they can have intelligence information come in and they can look at this with aerial photographs and reports and then make a decision based on all of that. That took time. I mean, in the chaos of the 1st of July, where in many battalions the commanding officer was killed or wounded, the second in command was a casualty, all the company commanders were casualties, the adjutant was a casualty, and so on, then you're getting very little clear intelligence, clear information coming back for anybody to make any kind of decision. So that movement of senior officers to stop attacks pretty much almost did not happen really on the 1st of July. Some brigade commanders did go forward. Brigadier General Bertie Prowse of the Somersets, who served as a regular officer, then was promoted to command the brigade. He went forward into the Heidenkopf, the Heathen's Head, the quadrilateral near Serre, because 4 of his battalion commanders had become casualties. He tried to take command himself, was mortally wounded, and died of his wounds on the 1st of July. So when these senior officers did go forward, they could then become casualties themselves, and that then broke down the whole momentum of battle. So it was a complex thing, really, and the lack of the ability to talk to your troops and for them to talk to you as a senior officer directly, quickly, meaningfully is what influenced very often the outcome of these kind of battles. But then going to the part 2 of your question, talk about the sounds from the battlefield on the night of the 1st of July. Now, sound, noise is something that is so intrinsically part of memory. Certain sounds can trigger memory. We've all probably had that in a lot of different aspects of our lives, and that was true for men in the Great War. But you imagine the Somme front on a warm evening of the 1st of July. It's now dark. Out in no man's land, there's still machine guns firing and rifle fire clacking away, and the shells are still dropping in certain areas. So it's not silent, far from it. But out there are men, hundreds of men, in some cases thousands of men scattered across that no man's land who are in cover, wounded, often seriously wounded, screaming, crying, calling out for help. I mean, that, having interviewed men who witnessed that at Serre and down at La Boisselle, one chap I interviewed who was in the 2nd Middlesex Regiment had gone over with them into Mash Valley. The battalion had suffered some staggering level of casualties, and he was one of the lucky few to get back to the British trenches, and he was haunted for the rest of his life by the cries from no man's land, not just of his men, but the other battalions that attacked alongside them. West Yorks were not very far away, the Devonshires and so on. And all of those men out there, this terrible kind of sound of men suffering because it was warm, they'd run out of water, they were parched, they were frightened, they were cut off, they had no idea what was going to happen next. So if the day had been hell on the Somme on the 1st of July, the night was a kind of different level of hell, I think, where you could go out, and there are examples of men going out under darkness to try and bring men in. Stretcher bearers went out, volunteers went out to try and bring their mates back, but it was dangerous because the Germans were now jumpy. There was a lot of random machine gun fire going on and rifle fire and trench mortars coming over and star shells going up to illuminate the battlefield, so it wasn't without risk. And there are probably 1,000 stories of this kind of thing happening, some of which survive, many of which have kind of disappeared into that wider history of the Great War because those men who carried out those deeds perhaps never told their story. And again, that's something I kind of think of every time I think of the stories that the veterans did tell me. You know, I only interviewed 350-odd veterans, and I know that's a huge number, but it's nothing compared to the volume of men that served in battles like this. And for every man that I spoke to, thousands, tens of thousands, never left any account of what they'd seen, what they'd gone through, or what they'd done. And I guess that's where our kind of imagination comes in when we read some of the accounts we do have, and we stand in those fields and we look down into Mash Valley or no man's land in the Newfoundland Park, and we imagine what that must have been like as darkness spread across the Somme front on that night of the 1st of July, and those men were trapped out there. I mean, there are some good accounts of this in some of Malcolm Brown's books, Tommy Goes to War and his book on the Battle of the Somme, Martin Middlebrook the same, Lynn MacDonald, all of those accounts that tap into the veterans' memoirs and interviews and letters and diaries give you an insight into this. But it is something that, as I've been on many occasions to Newfoundland Park at night when darkness spreads across that landscape of the Great War there, it kind of sends your mind into overtime, I think, and it's quite a special thing to do. So I think it shows that, just like you, John, for many of us, 110 years or more since these events, there's so much that makes us stop and think, so much that connects us to these places and connects us, kind of piques our fascination to understand not just the experience, but also the horror of that experience for many of the men who went through things like this. They could never be the same, could they, really, after a day like that, after hearing those men crying out from no man's land. And the Somme wasn't the only example of this. Yes, the British Army learnt from the Somme. Yes, by 1918 they were fighting modern battles. But along that learning curve, or whatever it is going to be called now, there is a price, and the price of casualties. Men out there in the darkness of no man's land, wondering if it's their journey's end or not. As ever, so much to ponder with the Great War. So thanks for some really great questions in this episode. Do keep sending them in via email and the Discord server and the other services that are available. And I'll see you again soon for some more questions and answers on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.